I want to go ahead and get started for our online training session today. We have got a lot to cover, so I'm going to want to get started right on time so we can get you out right on time. I want to welcome you to Budget and Appropriations 101, Understanding the Process and Timelines, and this is the American Association of Museums online advocacy training session, part 2. And have no fear, we'll be explaining muting, Q&A, and other details in just a moment. So, first of all, this is our list of topics. We'll talk a little bit about the logistics of the online training session for anyone who hasn't been on one before. Then we'll clarify some terms, talk about the normal process, what's happening with current appropriations and budget items, and advocacy approaches for each stage. We're going to cover a lot of information about a very complex process, so I hope that you will keep questions coming, and I'll explain how to do that in just a moment, and we'll address them as much as we can throughout. But do be assured that if you ask a question and we can't get to it during the session, we will get to it afterwards. Who's speaking? This is me. My name is Stephanie Vance. I am the advocacy guru, and I am reading a copy of a brilliant new book. Hey, it's by me. It's called Citizens in Action. And I spent a number of years working on Capitol Hill as a legislative staff person, as have many of your government relations staff. And so we have seen the legislative process from the inside, and we're hoping to bring some of those secrets to you all on this training session. Now, for logistics about the session, I want to explain a little bit about what's happening. First of all, what you're seeing is a viewer screen that is showing my screen on my computer in my office. And I'm showing you a PowerPoint that's on my computer. Everyone has entered in a mute-only mode, so that means that in order to ask questions, you're going to need to type a question into the Q&A box, and a couple of you have found that already, which is great. You'll see that if you look on the little toolbar on your screen, you'll see that there's something that says questions. Just make sure that you open that up, and you can type a question in. There's a couple questions right now about whether we will be able to see others on the session. And actually, for privacy reasons, we're not. And I should clarify that this is an online training session, which is a little different from some of the other services that are offered by the American Association of Museums. So it is a little bit different structured. And I did have a question, can everyone see what we write? And no, people can't. So, but please keep it clean there. All right. We're also recording the session for your future enjoyment, and if you found it so fascinating or you got confused by something, you want to go back and review it, the recording will be available. And follow-up materials, including the PowerPoint, will be available on the Speak Up for Museums page, and I'm going to just take you to that page very quickly so that you can see where you will find it. So you'll see part 1 of the online training session recording is here, and then once this one is over, because it's hard to post the recording until it's over, will be posted here along with the PowerPoint. And that's going to take a little bit of time because it takes some time for the recording to process. So that's the logistics of the session. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unmute Dr. Bell's line, who I was just mentioning is one of my favorite people because he's a veterinarian, and I actually didn't bring my dog in to join us for the webinar today, but I know he would always be happy to see you. He is the president of the American Association of Museums, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Bell.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I appreciate the warm introduction. I wish you brought your dog. I want to welcome everybody to part 2 of AAM's 4-part online advocacy training series. I'm excited that so many of you have decided to join us today for a very important and timely session on the federal budget process, something that is of interest to all of us. There's never been a more important time for us to work together, united as a field, and to make our voices heard. As you may have heard me say, increasing federal funding for museums is one of our absolute highest priorities at AAM. Unfortunately, as some of you have discovered, the federal budget process is a long and complicated one, and that doesn't make our jobs any easier. Trying to navigate budget resolutions, budget reconciliation, authorizations, budget authority, appropriations bills, and continuing resolutions, well, like many of you, I find all that to be a little confusing and daunting, but that's exactly why we're doing this session today. We all need to better understand the process if we are going to influence it. We have already seen fundings for museums come under attack several times this year in the U.S. Congress. And our success in defeating these attacks shows just how far we have come as a field. But we need to consistently weigh in at every stage of the process, not just when the attacks come. And we need to know whom to contact and when to contact them. We need to develop relationships with elected officials to continually reinforce the public value of museums. It's a message that is extraordinarily important. Today's training session is a great first step toward meeting these goals. As you know, there will be 2 more installments of the series leading up to Museums Advocacy Day, March 22 through 23, 2010, where we hope to see each and every one of you in the flesh here in Washington. Achieving critical mass at next year's Advocacy Day is going to be crucial to our success as a field, including our efforts to increase federal funding for museums. And you can learn more about Museums Advocacy Day by visiting www.speakupformuseums.org. Finally, I want to remind you that today's online training session is just one of the many learning opportunities and benefits that AAM provides the museum field. AAM's Museum Essentials webinar series, hosted in collaboration with Learning Times and the Museum Assessment Program, covers everything from strategic thinking and planning, collections and project management, to human resources and interpretive planning. And you can find out more about that Museum Essentials webinar series at www.aam-us.org. And if you're not already an AAM member, this is the year to join us. AAM members benefit from deep discounts on professional development programs, both live and on demand. A deeply discounted rate for AAM's annual meeting, which will be held in Los Angeles next year, and our first truly international meeting with tracks in both Spanish and Mandarin. Members receive 6 issues of our great museum magazine and discounted rates on more than 300 titles from the AAM bookstore. And of course, members get access to our information center, which offers expert assistance and confidential, customized guidance on any museum matter. There's a lot going on at AAM and many ways for you to get involved. So visit our website or get in touch with me directly. It's fbell, F as in Ford, B-E-L-L, at aam-us.org to learn more about any of our programs and services. If I don't know the answer, I'll get you to the person that does. So thanks again for your interest and for being with us today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our very own advocacy guru and dog owner, Stephanie Vance.
Thank you very much, Ford. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and mute your line again, but it's great to have the leadership engaged in this session because I think that's very important to recognizing how important these issues are to the museum community. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on. And what I want to do is actually ask a couple quick questions via poll. And those who've been on the session before know we do a couple polls. I promise there won't be too many. We just want to get a sense of where our audience is in the advocacy process and how many people are engaged in this session. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll. And just ask you very quickly how many people are gathered with you to watch today's session. And if you can just click on one of the options. Is it just you? Are there a couple people? Are there 4 or 5, 6 to 10? Or have you gathered an entire village? And because it does take a village to do budget issues. We've got 88% of the votes in. 89%. We'll wait for a couple more seconds just to make sure everyone has an opportunity to vote. We've got 90% of the votes in. I think that's a good percentage, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share with you the results. Most of us, it's individuals, but we have several that 16% of us are 2 or 3 people, and then a few of us have gathered 6 to 10 or more than 10. And do remember that if you want to gather more people for these sessions, it is a great opportunity to share the wealth, as it were. And for those who are wondering how many people total we have on the session, we did have 150 register. So we've got more people coming in and going out as we go through the session here. Now, my next question, how familiar are you with the federal budget process? And again, I'm going to open this poll and just ask you if you can let us know a little bit about where you are. I'm not very familiar with it. I know a little bit, but it seems confusing. I'm familiar with the process, but unsure how it connects to us, or I'm very familiar with the process and have been engaged in the past. And as we'll wait for those votes to come in, we've got 88%, 90%, 92%. All right, I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results so we all know where we are. And most of us are not very familiar with the budget process or know a little bit about it, but it seems confusing, which is perfectly reasonable. And a few of us are familiar but aren't quite sure how it relates to us or our museums, and some are very familiar. And I hope that if you are very familiar, you'll be sending us some ideas and chat messages through the Q&A box so that your great ideas can be shared with others on the call. So this gives me a good sense of where we are in the process and is very helpful, and I appreciate everyone being willing to undertake these polls because it does give us a lot of valuable information. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on and start with our clarifying a few terms. So I want to make sure that we're all starting with a very good sense of some of the terms involved in the federal budget process. And so we'll talk about what's the budget, what are appropriations, what are authorizations, and why does this matter. And what I want to do right now is give you a pretty general outline, and then I'm going to talk about how these various different processes interact throughout the year. So when we're talking about the budget, we're really talking about two items. We're talking about a budget resolution, and we're talking about a budget reconciliation. Now, the budget resolution is a fiscal blueprint. The President of the United States proposes one, and usually that happens in February, and we'll talk about that process in just a moment. But usually the President proposes one, and the Congress says, okay, thank you very much for your proposal, Mr. President, but we're actually going to develop our own. And depending on who's in party, who's in charge, which party is in charge, sometimes what the Congress develops is very much in keeping with what the President proposes, and sometimes it's not. But the most important thing to remember is that the budget itself is simply a fiscal blueprint. It's a resolution. It doesn't get signed into law. It's sort of the general outline of what the Congress and the President believe that the federal government should be spending money on. Then the next piece of the budget is the budget reconciliation. And what this is it's a bill that is put together by various authorizing and policy committees that reconciles existing laws with what is proposed in the budget resolution. So, for example, as we're seeing this year, if the budget resolution calls for health care reform, the House and Senate tax writing committees have to pass a bill changing the laws on how to pay for it. And that is called the reconciliation process. And again, it's just easy to think of it as there's existing law, and you need to reconcile it with what you want to do in the budget resolution. So that's why it's called a budget reconciliation. And you see a lot of pieces of legislation kind of being stuck onto a budget reconciliation bill. We'll talk about how that works in just a moment. Beyond the budget, another important thing to remember, another important term to understand are appropriations. Appropriations are actual dollars for programs. So this is the cash. And appropriations are developed by appropriations committees in keeping with numbers that are outlined in the budget blueprint. So when the budget committee comes up with its fiscal blueprint and it looks at all of the different programs for discretionary spending, it says, okay, here's how much each of the appropriations bills are going to get to spend. And that is actual cash. That's obviously going to be pretty important to the funding that we want for our community. Another important term to understand are authorizations. These are different from appropriations. These are policy laws, and they establish the programs that are funded through appropriations. It's very important to recognize that even though you might have a program that is authorized, even if it's authorized at a certain level, if there's not an appropriation for that particular program, it won't get any actual cash. So the law establishing the Institute of Museum and Library Services is an example of an authorizing law. It establishes it, and there's often policy changes made, through authorizing programs. But in order to actually get funds, you also have to go through an appropriations process. I know that seems a little confusing, but hopefully there's a little bit more clarification. If you just remember that the budget is a fiscal blueprint, that the budget reconciliation reconciles existing laws with what is proposed in the budget blueprint, that appropriations are actual cash, and that authorizations are policy laws. As we go through, we'll have a little bit more clarification on each of those terms. But why this really matters is this explains, hopefully a little bit, why it sometimes feels like you're being asked to lobby on the same things over and over again. Museum interests are part of all aspects of the budget process, from the resolution to the reconciliation to appropriations to authorization. And so you may sometimes be asked to lobby on an authorization issue, on an appropriation issue, and you may be thinking to yourself, oh, didn't I just do this? But they are all very separate steps, and all of them need advocacy from the museum community in order to move forward. All right, so moving on with that very short clarification of the budget process, I want to tell you a little bit about the normal process. Now, I really want to stress this is what's supposed to happen. Whether it actually happens is, well, it's pretty rare that it actually happens this way, but this is how the process is supposed to work. The President, as I mentioned, submits a budget proposal usually in early February. Now, this year it was a little different because the President had just come into office and he hadn't had an opportunity to put together the budget until a little bit later in the year. But imagine this year, coming up in 2010, he will be submitting his budget proposal in February. And again, remember, that's his proposal. That's his idea for how he thinks money should be spent. Congress reviews and develops its own version, the budget resolution, by April 15th. And it's important, again, to understand that these really are just outlines and proposals. So, from my experiences working on Capitol Hill, sometimes people will come and say to me, well, this particular program is in the President's budget, so doesn't that mean it's funded? And it doesn't. So it's very important to recognize that even if someone suggested something, you need to have continued advocacy to make sure it makes it all the way through the process. Now, that said, the budget resolution, although not law and not signed by the President, does provide these two important sets of instructions that are really going to impact how funding is realized in the real world. And these are, as I mentioned, the reconciliation. So the budget resolution indicates what laws need to be changed in order to keep in line with the budget outline, and the appropriations numbers. So these allocations are given to the appropriations committees, and the budget committee basically says, this is how much money you're going to get to spend in your overall appropriations bill. Now, recognizing that this is a little confusing, we do have a timeline here that we've linked to, and you can actually, as we're getting it to pull up in the audience view, and I know that might take just a moment. When you receive the PowerPoint from on the page that I showed you where the follow-up materials are going to be posted, you can link to this page. It's from the National Priorities Project, and it outlines the different dates of different steps and the different dates. So you can scroll through and see what happens during the budget process. And it's just a useful document in case you just can't remember all of this that happens in the normal budget process. All right, so that's the key steps in the normal budget resolution process. Now, turning to the reconciliation process, and again, stressing that this is the normal process. So-called policy or authorizing committees, these are the committees that make policy laws. So basically, they're all the committees that are not the appropriations committees. They make the changes to existing laws that to ensure that they comply with the budget resolution. And the laws that are being changed are authorizing laws. Now, time-wise, the reconciliation is supposed to happen by the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. That rarely happens, but it is supposed to be completed by then. But there may be times when museum issues may be part of the budget reconciliation, and again, that's different from the budget resolution. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how this applies this year, because there's some interesting things going on with the budget reconciliation and healthcare reform, as you may have heard. All right. The normal process for appropriations. The appropriations committees and the 12 subcommittees meet March through May to develop spending bills, and these are, again, based on those numbers that the budget resolution outlined. As these bills are supposed to be sent to the floor by the summer, passed by both houses, conferenced, which means that the House and the Senate have to look at their own versions of the bills and then agree with each other about which programs to fund, et cetera, and then pass a bill that both houses can agree to, and then completed by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. This is, again, what's supposed to happen, and you can usually keep track of what's going on with the federal appropriations on the Library of Congress's Thomas website, and this is their appropriations chart. Now, as you look at this, you might think to yourself, oh, man, I don't want to keep track of all this. Well, the good news is you've got your American Association of Museums Government Relations staff who does keep track of all this. But if you do want to sort of see what's going on, this is just an interesting resource. One of my favorite things to do is to look at this right around September 30th and see how many things aren't completed, because that always amuses me a little bit. So again, this is the Library of Congress's Thomas website. It's the appropriations chart. And again, just for your edification, if you want to learn a little bit more about the appropriations process, but don't be too concerned about keeping track of all of those different bills. All right, so that's the normal process. Now, what happens when things go haywire, as they often do? If the process is not completed by September 30th, there's a continuing resolution. You all may have heard of a CR. This basically is a bill that Congress passes that says, let's keep the government funding at the current levels until we can get our act in gear. They don't actually use those terms, and get all of our appropriations bills completed. The government is currently operating under a continuing resolution because, as you saw on the chart, not all of the appropriations bills were done, and that continuing resolution is running through October 31st. Now, you may have remembered several years ago that Congress was in a little fight with the President, and they decided they weren't going to pass a continuing resolution, and the government shut down. I remember that because my husband at the time was working for the government, and we managed to get the basement really cleaned out while he was at home for 4 days. But since then, most people don't think that's the best solution. Now, again, I should stress that the appropriations committees will continue to meet after May as needed, or on any bills that they don't get to before the end of the fiscal year. So I showed you the normal process. If you're thinking to yourself, though, wow, it's September, it's October, why are we still talking about appropriations? They were supposed to be done this summer. It's because things often go haywire. In fact, I'm going to ask someone to send into the Q&A box if they've got any guesses as to how many times Congress has met the deadlines we've just talked about in the last decade. And people saw where I was going, and I've got 0, 0, 0, 0. Yes, in fact, it is 0. They haven't actually, someone said once, but they actually didn't use the normal process. There was one time when they were sort of done by September 30th, but it was because they just decided to fund everything through a continuing resolution because they knew they were going to argue about it. So, yes, things always go haywire. Sometimes I don't even know why I tell you what the normal process is, but hopefully it's interesting to you. All right, it's confusing, but there's good news. The AAM Government Relations team is always ready to help, and you can always find current information and action alerts, advocacy updates, and they try to break the process down into tasty morsels of information, and all the types of information are available 24/7 at the Speak Up for Museums website. So if you go to this site, and this is where you're getting all of the information, too, about the online training series, you'll get all kinds of information about any action alerts that are needed to make a difference on any of these budget or appropriations issues. It is confusing. There's a lot of stuff going on. That's why you've got your great team in Washington that is helping to try and track all of this for you. But they do need your help because the people that have the most influence with their congressional offices are you all. So they're there to keep track of it all and let you know when your voice is most needed, and are always happy to answer any questions that you might have about the process. And speaking of questions, I'm going to just go into the Q&A box and see if we've got any questions at this point that I can address. And I'm going to just, I have a question here. How do earmarks figure into the process? Thank you for that. I'm going to actually address that in a moment. But for those who are asking for individual earmarks, or, depending on how you feel about them, pork. One man's pork is another man's bacon, I guess. From your legislators, you do need to be talking with your legislators very early in the process, and individual legislators do have a process of getting in touch with the appropriations committees, but those are attached to appropriations bills, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment. And I have a question here. If AAM has a graphic representation of where resolutions, reconciliations, appropriations stands for each of the federal agencies. And I think we'll need to address that separately offline. But we will be talking in a minute about the various different appropriations issues and resolution and reconciliation issues that AAM is following. All right. So what is going on with appropriations for FY 2010? As I mentioned, Congress passed the CR on September 30th because not all the appropriations bills are finished, as we saw in the status chart. And AAM's priority in appropriations continues to be IMLS funding and, of course, the Office of Museum Services within there. And I'm going to just open up very quickly a PDF from the Speak Up for Museums site that's going to give you the basic background information on this particular issue. You can download it, and again, here's the link, and when you receive the PowerPoint, you'll be able to access it directly. But this gives you information on what is going on with that particular issue right now, so you can get the current status. You don't need to try and figure out the confusing chart. And you can also see what the specific request is that AAM is, the field-wide request that AAM is suggesting. Obviously, also, AAM is following a range of federal acronyms: NSF, NEA, NEH, NPS, and the Department of Education. And for those who can't keep track without a scorecard, NSF is the National Science Foundation, NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, NPS, National Park Service, and the Department of Education. These are also, of course, very important to the museum community, and so AAM spends a lot of time trying to track those as well. And, of course, it's very important to ensure that other bills do not restrict funding. Many of you were engaged in the recent Coburn Amendment, and you'll see that as part of the enhancements program, there was an effort to try and suggest that no funds would be available for a museum. And many of you were engaged in making sure that this amendment didn't pass. And so that is an example, I believe, of advocacy at its most effective, because most people don't connect museums and transportation, but they should, because so many of the programs are critical to the services you're providing. So this is where you can get the information on what's going on for FY 2010 for the appropriations. Now, what's going on with the budget for FY 2010? As I mentioned, the President submitted a budget in March of 2009. Congress passed a budget resolution in April 2009, and a budget reconciliation bill is pending. Now, as I mentioned, the budget reconciliation is an interesting process. It's a normal, standard part of the budget process. This year, though, because the budget resolution does talk about health care reform, there is talk of doing the health care reform bill through the budget reconciliation process. And you may have heard some people suggesting, oh, there's a crazy process that they're using for health care reform. It's a reconciliation process. One of the reasons, of course, why they want to do it this way is because a budget reconciliation bill is considered under different rules in the House and Senate. It's easier to get things through the process in a budget reconciliation bill. So if healthcare reform is attached to the budget reconciliation bill, that means that it might be a little bit easier to manage the debate on the bill. Now that said, the budget reconciliation isn't a strange, unusual parliamentary process. It's something that's a standard part of the budget process in the United States. So just be aware of that as you're hearing about healthcare reform and people suggesting that they're pulling some strange parliamentary procedure out of the hat. It is pretty much a standard, although often confusing, part of the process. All right, what's going on with the U.S. budget for FY 2011? Because believe it or not, although we're not done with FY 2010, we are now thinking about FY 2011. And federal agencies are working right now on their budget submissions to the Office of Management and Budget. And to be clear, the Office of Management and Budget is the central federal agency organizing entity. So it pulls in all of the requests from the various federal agencies, puts them together, works with the various agencies on what's possible and what's not, and puts together the overall presidential administration budget. This is what the President submits to Congress in early February. And one interesting thing is to try and keep track of the State of the Union at the end of January, which often signals the President's intentions as to what he intends in the budget. And I know I wrote he, and it's because up to now it's been a he. So hopefully at some point it'll be a she. Ooh, sorry, I just made a political statement. But at any rate, the State of the Union does signal intentions as to the budget, what the President is going to propose in the budget. So it's something definitely to keep track of, because it will give you a sense of where he's going with it. Okay. Some advocacy approaches, why this matters. And before I get into this, I'm going to just check in on to see if there's any questions at this point. And I've got the transportation. First of all, I've got a hand raised, and I'm not sure if someone did that intentionally. So I'm just going to check in here. If you've raised your hand, I actually can't unmute your line, so if you can actually type a question into the Q&A box, or you can type a question into the chat box, that would be great. And if you can't, you can follow up. I'll show the contact information afterwards, and you can follow up via email with the AAM staff. So I've got a question here. Does the transportation bill follow the same rules when it's only done every few years? This is a good question because it gives me an opportunity to again mention the difference between appropriation and authorization. So the transportation appropriation bill is done every year. The transportation authorization bill is done every 6 years. Well, it's supposed to be 6 years. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's 10. But these are two different bills. So one bill is setting the policies, and one bill is setting the funding. And again, the appropriations bills are done every year, so that's the actual cash that's moving through the process. So just remember to keep that in mind when you're thinking about the differences between the actual funding and between the policy changes that are made. Okay, great. And so moving on to advocacy approaches. This, as you're looking at these different complicated process, and I'm sure everyone's like, budget and appropriations and authorizations, oh my, I'm wandering in a wilderness. If you want to be an effective advocate, I think you really need to focus on 4 things. And those 4 things are who's in charge, who should ask, when to ask, and how to ask, especially in what are some tough economic times. So the first question here is who's in charge? And the best place to start whenever you're thinking about any budget, appropriations, funding kind of issue is your congressional representative's office. So the question had come earlier about the earmarks process, and I had another question earlier. If I've got an individual request into my legislator's office, how do I manage that process? And of course, you want to get started with your own congressional representative. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to manage your individual requests. And a general overall rule of thumb is never worry too much about pestering them. I mean, I wouldn't say call them every 2 days and say like, hey, if I got my appropriation, I've got my appropriation. But you do, if you contact them every month, every couple months, you're probably not over contacting them. The problem is usually not enough contact as opposed to too much. So don't worry too much about bugging them. Be polite, be persistent. If they are feeling overwhelmed, they'll let you know. But for the most part, persistence is pretty critical. Now, when we're talking about some of the field-wide funding requests, it's important to recognize the individuals in charge of that are obviously the appropriators, but never let your members of Congress say, oh, well, I'm not an appropriator, so I can't really do anything to help you. Because for members who are not on appropriations, they can actually send letters to appropriators. And so we're going to click on a link here of an example of a letter from last time, a Tonko Slaughter letter. And you'll see that this was from other members of Congress writing to the appropriators, asking them to support the $50 million for the Office of Museum Services. So your members of Congress, even if they're not on appropriations, can support the field-wide funding request. And the AAM is hoping that for next year in February that they'll have one of those sign-on letters available to coincide with Advocacy Day. The timing is not in the hands of your government relations staff. It's in the hands of members of Congress. So they will be doing their best to try and get that together in time for the Advocacy Day, and they'll really push on that. But do recognize that the AAM government relations staff aren't the ones that actually send out the letter, so they do need to make sure that their champions are on board with that. Now, if you've got members on appropriations, ask them to support the funding request in the committee and on the floor, because they do have a lot of influence there. Now, you can use the speakupformuseums.org website to find out if your members are on the Appropriations Committee. And you also want to be sure to thank your legislators who take these steps. And I'm going to take us to a link to a thank you action alert. And you can see that this is to send a special email thank you to your legislators. And when you type in your basic information, your first name, your last name, your address, and you have to type in all of this information because your legislators want to know that you are actually a constituent, you will see that this is the information, this is the draft thank you note. And if you type in all this information and for some reason your letter, it's not pulling up and it's not, it's not going to be sending a thank you note, it's because this thank you form is set up to go to the legislators who signed on to the letter. So if your legislator didn't sign on to the letter, it's probably not appropriate to thank them for doing so. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. So, but this is a great website where you can track down this information. And if you click on the Contact Congress link, you will see the various issues that are coming up at this time. Now, if you're wondering, well, how do I use this to look up my legislator? I'm actually going to ask someone to type a zip code into the Q&A box. So if I could just have someone type a zip code. Okay, I've got one here. And we'll hit enter. And this will give you the information about who your legislator is on. Now, if you want to, you'll see that in some cases it might be split. So you'll see at the state level, it gives you the state level legislators, and in some cases it might be split because of where you live. But you'll see your member of the House is Ms. McCarthy. And so if you click on that link, you'll get the contact information, and you can see here information about her committees. So that question about appropriations versus non-appropriations can be answered here. And you'll see she's not on appropriations. She's on some important committees. But that would be a good opportunity. She would be a person to ask if she would be willing to sign a letter to the appropriators. So I hope that's useful. And again, if you typed in your zip code and you didn't type it in fast enough, that's okay. You haven't failed because you can go to the Speak Up for Museums website and you can actually type in your own zip code and get the answers there. So, all right. And I have a question here. Can we customize the content of the thank you letter? I do believe the content can be customized. And again, if you want to customize it and it's difficult to identify the best way to do that on the site, you can always cut and paste the text and create your own. So, and that's a great question because it's so important to make sure that these communications are personalized. I mean, I think it's better to send any kind of thank you note, whether it's personalized or not, but to personalize the communication is really going to make it rise up to the top and capture people's attention. I also should clarify when we were looking back at who's in charge that members of the committee may or may not approve the field funding request. So simply because it's been requested doesn't mean that that's definitely going to be approved by the appropriators. And it takes a lot of ongoing advocacy and persistence to get those numbers up to where we want them to be. All right, so we talked about who's in charge, and now we need to think about who should do the asking. And politics is not a spectator sport. Grassroots advocacy has the most impact of any form of communication, so your voices are absolutely critical to the process. Anytime any of your government relations staff meet with a legislator, you know, if Gail or Ember or Carla talk with someone, the very first thing that office is asking is, how does this connect to the people that I represent? So you really also, as sort of advocate leaders in the field, I mean, you have two responsibilities. One is obviously your own responsibility to be advocates, but the other is how you can get others engaged. And so you want to think broadly about what citizen communication means. It means you, it means museum staff, it means friends, it means trustees, supporters, volunteers, really anyone who is engaged in the museum community in your area, seeing how you can get them engaged in the advocacy process. And the speakupformuseums.org website is open to anyone who wants to go and send a letter. I could send one if I wanted, and I think anyone can use it for that purpose. So, all right, so who's in charge, who should ask, when you should ask. This is sort of a timeline, and again, I should mention that this PowerPoint will be available after the session, so if you're looking at it and thinking, oh, wait, January to March, wait, what do I do? This is a rough timeline. Now, remember that this is kind of based on the normal process, so you may have requests from AAM to get engaged later in the process than you would think was normal, but that's just kind of how it works. January through March are requests to individual offices. So this is when you might put in a request for your own individual program that you want more funding for, a grant request, an earmark request. This is also where the field-wide funding request comes into play and where we start building the pressure for program funding. And, of course, Museums Advocacy Day cleverly falls right in the midst of that in February. I want to make sure that you all know that the registration is open for Museums Advocacy Day 2010, so you can take a look at this. It will give you all the information about how you register. You see there's two different ways to register, and the tentative schedule is up here as well. So please take a look at that and make sure that you register, because we need every warm body there. March through June, focus on appropriators or on asking individual members to reach out to appropriators. This is going to be an ongoing process, January through when the bill is actually finally completed. July, floor votes might start. They might not. We rarely know. But this is going to be a good opportunity for general outreach. Oh, and I'm sorry, I said February and I meant March. My apologies there. It's March 22nd and 23rd, but it still fits into that early January through March time frame, so it's a great opportunity. August is district visits. So while you should be thinking about district visits through the whole process when legislators are back in their districts during their district work period, August is a great opportunity to bring them into your museum to show them what's going on, because that really helps them see, oh, okay, we gave this much funding last year, and here's how it's being utilized in our community. And then floor votes and possible conference committee efforts are September through December, sometimes into January, February. It's an exciting process, and we all love it very much. The process, it's important to keep in mind, really unfolds uniquely throughout the year, and your government relations team is going to help keep track through the year. You aren't expected to remember all of these dates and remember all of these charts. You've got some great people who are doing that. It's a lot to keep track of, but they really do their best to keep you apprised. And hopefully, as you learn a little bit about how convoluted this all is, you might have a little bit of patience with them if they can't always get to your questions right away. They are definitely working night and day. In fact, I got an email from Carla at midnight last night, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. So they're really working night and day to make sure that they're getting the information to you. All right, now I also want to talk about how to ask, especially in tough economic times. But I also want to make sure I'm going to address a couple questions here. Yes, and someone did mention February. I thought it was March. Again, my sincere apologies. The Advocacy Day is in March, not February. I'm just so excited for it to happen that I want it to be earlier, but it's in March. All right. I also have a question here about the appropriate place for hosting receptions or fundraisers. And I had mentioned district visits, of course, as something to consider in getting your legislators into your library. If you want to into your museum, if you want to be a little bit more politically active, you can host a reception or a fundraiser. You can get engaged in the electoral process. The only thing you need to make sure that you're familiar with is your status and whether you're able to endorse candidates. So think about checking out the State Board of Elections website for your state, as well as some of the 501c3 restrictions, just to make sure that you're on the right side of the law in that. And then there are also restrictions on being engaged around various electoral dates. So that's something that will vary from place to place, and you're going to need to be familiar with that. But that's a great point, that your museum can be a great place for hosting receptions or fundraisers. All right, and I had a question here before we go on. How can one find out in advance a legislator's inclinations regarding a certain appropriation? That's a great question. You can actually take a look, if you look on the Speak Up for Museums site, for example, you saw the Tonko Slaughter letter from this recent year. You can see if they signed on to that particular letter. If they didn't, it doesn't mean that they don't like what is being proposed for the Office of Museum Services. It just may mean that someone hasn't really asked them yet. So don't assume that they're not for the appropriation. Just assume that maybe they haven't been asked. So you can take a look at that. That will give you a sense. You can also feel free to ask the staff. As you're making that ask and you're talking to the person that handles these issues for the legislator, you can ask them, has the legislator taken a position on these appropriations in the past? And that can also be a great way to get some of that information. All right, so asking, especially in tough economic times. If possible, and I recognize that not all messages relate to these two themes, so if possible, connect your message to the idea of jobs and helping struggling families and communities. As museums, you have employees, so you definitely can have a job message there. And you can personalize this with local stories and anecdotes. And even if you can't connect it to those key themes, the really important things to do is to personalize your communication with the local stories and anecdotes. And sort of talk about if your museum has had to lay off people or cut back hours, or you did a food drive, or really anything that you've done that the economy is impacted, don't assume that your legislators know that. Make sure that you tell them. In fact, it's often safe to assume that your legislators don't really know what you're having to do in this particular economy, and how a federal partnership will help you get people rehired, get your hours back up, help you be better engaged in efforts to help out in the community. Now, the good news is that AAM has put together a template, an economic impact statement template, that you can access. This is, again, the speakupformuseums.org website. And if you look at this, there's a great deal of information, but you'll see here is the economic impact statement that you can open up, and it's going to give you some basic information that you can fill out. It's got, excuse me, this is opening up. Okay, there we go. My museum employs a number of people in our community, annual budget, and then it gives you some talking points for the national level. But this is something you can fill in for your own particular museum. Now, it's a blank form that's meant to be used by every museum to capture information about their work in the community for their legislators. Some museums really dress theirs up, adding their logos and images as background for the information that the basic form captures. And here's an example from the Woodson Art Museum. They've got pictures. They've got pictures of adorable children here. I don't have the whole screenshot here, but you'll see how they put together a really nice document that when they hand it to their legislators, it gives the basic background information, and it also delivers the message that they're providing people, they're employing people, they spend a certain amount of money, they serve an estimated number of visitors, etc. So it's just a very nice way, and as museums, we always present things beautifully, I know. A very nice way of presenting the information to the legislators. All right. Now, I've got a few minutes to take some questions here, and before I wrap it up, I do have a couple questions to address. I think I've addressed, let's see, I'm just reading these. Is it appropriate to ask congresspeople from other states to advocate for you to the Appropriations Committee on your behalf because citizens from their state frequent your museum? Emily, that is a great question. I think when you contact a legislator, again, the first thing they're wondering is how do you connect to the people I represent? So maybe in that case, you can go to them and you can say, here, we serve, our statistics show that we serve, 3,500 people in your state, and these 3,500 people are, you might even have a smaller number of people that are subscribers or ongoing friends of the museum. And you go to the legislator and you show them that, and they may be willing to reach out to appropriators on your behalf because of that. I also think that building a coalition with those individuals. Remember when we talked about who should do the asking, sometimes it's you, sometimes it's staff, friends, trustees, supporters, volunteers. Taking a look at the individuals who are coming from those other states, seeing if any of them are supporters, volunteers, members of the Friends Network, and maybe they would be willing to reach out to those legislators. Those legislators are going to be a lot more likely to pay attention to someone who's actually from their community. My default, though, is always, go ahead and try it. If you can make a constituency connection, there's no harm in asking. The worst that's going to happen is they will say no. And I think you'll be a lot more successful if you build up a relationship with the people from that legislator's district, if possible. And I've got a note here, please, as we were just talking about. Please discuss partnerships with other organizations to increase the likelihood that your request will receive serious consideration. For example, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum sometimes has been cited as a quote-unquote poster child for earmarks, even though the educational programs are award-winning, and that the museum partners with other local school districts with other educational programs. And that's a perfect example of building those coalitions within the community that can be utilized to capture the attention of the legislators. And actually, our future sessions, we're actually having a session on making your case 101, what to say, how to say it, and getting your staff and visitors involved in the museum's cause. And so we'll be talking about how you build those kinds of coalitions, but that's a great example. Thank you very much. And I've got another quick note here. Not all preservation and conservation issues are related to jobs and struggling families. What themes should be used for these? I hopefully think that, many of these questions about number of people employed and amount spent and serving estimated number of visitors, et cetera, might be universal. If it's not, to me, though, the critical thing is to make sure that the message is personalized, that you're telling the story of that individual community. It may not be jobs, it may not be helping struggling families or communities. If you can't make that assessment, or that correlation right now, that's okay. Just make sure that that message is personalized. All right. Wrapping it up, a checklist for budget planning. And this is really everything that we've just sort of talked about, trying to put onto one slide, which is why there's so much text on it. But just for you to kind of take a look at, if you have an opportunity after the session to go through the materials, knowing what you want, the background research, how much funding does IMLS get now? If you have a grant, how much is it? What did you spend the grant funds on? How much does IMLS really need to serve the museum field? Many of those answers, the field-wide ones, can be answered by the materials we've already shown you. Who can you approach? Making sure you know your legislators. How can you approach them? Making sure that you've engaged the coalitions that we've heard some examples of, the visitors, the friends, etc. Direct lobbying by yourself. And don't forget, of course, Museums Advocacy Day. Understanding where you are on that timeline and recognizing that that timeline is not absolute. And finally, making sure that you've got a plan B or a plan C or a plan D, because sometimes, despite all of your best planning, the process doesn't always work out the way that we'd like it to. The one thing that always works in advocacy is persistence. So for the folks who have been asking about, when should I get in touch with my legislators? How often should I get in touch with my legislators? Again, I think that you want to be polite, but you want to be persistent. Never feel like you're bugging them too much until they tell you, and then you'll know. But for the most part, the main problem is people not following up, not people following up too much. So how can you be more persistent? Attend our future online training sessions. We've got part 3 coming up on building those relationships, really some key strategies for getting to know your elected officials. Part 4 is making your case 101, and that's where we're going to talk about how you engage others. Registering, of course, for Museums Advocacy Day 2010. The Speak Up for Museums site, we've shown you where there's the letters on the site that people can send to legislators, subscribing to the action alerts so that you know when to call your legislators, and working with your AAM government relations team that can really help. And I should note, for those of you who are attending Museums Advocacy Day, and I hope most of you are planning to do so, it's really an entry point to your ongoing communications with the legislators so that when issues come up, you've got a business card with someone's name to call. Attending that is not the end-all, be-all of your advocacy. It's really the start for the year. So I hope that you all will plan to attend that in March. And with that, I'm going to give you the contact information for your AAM Government Relations team. These are the folks that are doing all the hard work for you in Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to check to see if we've got any final questions before I see if Gail wants to wrap it up. And I did have a question here. Do I have a degree in public policy or political science, or have I just learned from this experience? Thank you for that question, because actually I do have a completely useless master's degree in legislative affairs, which I had to take a bunch of budget classes, and I was like, what am I ever going to do with all this stuff? And then I got into this and recognized, oh, this is how I can learn about how I can share my knowledge about the budget process. And once you learn a little bit about it, it's not too difficult to keep straight. And Gail, I'm going to actually unmute your line and see if you want to wrap things up, just to say some final words to the folks on our call. So Gail, your line is unmuted.
Hi there. Thanks, Stephanie.
Hello.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for being here today and hope that everyone will register right away for the next session, and know that we're tracking everything we can track, and welcome your questions. I think this entire process is a learning process for all of us. Things change very quickly. They change in ways sometimes that are very surprising to even us who have been working on this for many, many years. So continue to ask us questions, and let us know how we can help in the advocacy training arena. We know that a lot of people have asked for advocacy training, and yet when we offer it, we hope that we're serving your needs. So we really want to hear back from you after this program, and thanks again for participating.
All right, and that's what we've got to tell you about the budget process, and we look forward to seeing you on a future session. Thanks so much for being on the call.